I'll maybe give it 1 more minute or so. Okay, I think just as this is a lightning talk block, I will get on with it. All right, so hi everyone, welcome along. Thank you for coming to this lightning talk block. We're very excited. We have 2 speakers in this block, so I won't waste too much time. The session itself is about 30 minutes, so the speakers have kind of plenty of time, and we'll also have plenty of time for questions / discussion at the end if necessary, or if desired. Okay, so we have our first speaker is Alessandro van den Berg, and the title of his talk is to state your incentive. So Alessandro, would you like to share screen and get everything up and running?
Well, okay. All right, I think we're good.
Yep, all good.
Great. Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's first lightning talk at the online SIPS conference titled State Your Incentive. My name is Alessandro. I'm currently a research assistant at Leiden University in the Netherlands. I conducted this research in collaboration with Dr. Steven Verheijen, who's also here today, an assistant professor of cognitive psychology at the Erasmus University in Rotterdam. Today, I want to start with a brief introduction on incentivization, including our research questions, followed by a discussion on how we collect the data. Then I will discuss our main findings and end with the implications of our research, along with a number of recommendations. Why incentivization? In order to answer that question, we first have to define it. In our research, incentivization is understood as the practice of providing compensation, benefits, or rewards to participants with a reimbursement for their time, effort, and overall participation in a study. Incentivization, we believe, is a critical piece needed to understand the trust that individuals have in psychological research. After all, incentives directly state who participates and how engaged they are in research, which ultimately affects the outcomes of a study. Yet, despite their importance, research rarely assesses the extent to which authors omit these relevant details, creating a blind spot in methodological transparency. In recent years, particularly the Open Science Collaboration's Reproducibility Project in 2015, which exposed the infamous replication crisis, the psychological science community has increasingly emphasized the importance of transparency to enhance the reproducibility and credibility of research findings. However, studies have identified gaps in reporting of methodological details, such as participant compensation, which can impact the interpretation and ethical assessment of research. Now, disclosing a participant's compensation is crucial for understanding the participant's motivation. Studies show that depending on various participant characteristics, the type of compensation that they receive actually affects the recruitment and dependent outcomes of a study. Data on compensation schemes allows researchers to obtain an insight into the factors that influence behavior within a particular experimental setting. In this case, disclosing compensation details goes way beyond reporting whether participants were paid or not. It is important to include amount, the type of incentive, for example, monetary payments, work credits, or gift cards, and the duration of the experiment in order to understand the full impact of the incentive. From early studies, we see that most of these categories of metadata are underreported in research papers. In fact, a small number of articles look at a relatively minor sample clinical and psychology studies and show, in some cases, rates of transparency that paint a bleak picture of reporting standards. Specifically, clinical trials reviewed by 2 papers studied a reporting rate of 2.26%, and an earlier study by Cliffman and colleagues from 2007 showed a reporting rate of 15.5%. Now, more recently, Cordero and colleagues reviewed 236 studies published in psychology journals that showed a reporting rate of 50%, which is significantly better than earlier attempts at addressing these rates, but are still shockingly low in our opinion. Now, to our knowledge, no one has yet assessed incentivization practices in psychological research on the same or similar scale as we did. Which brings me to our main research question, concern the rate of omission of compensation details. In other words, what proportion of studies published in psychology journals fail to disclose methodological details concerning incentivization? And how have these rates changed in a 5-year period, specifically closely following the infamous replication crisis paper? In terms of our data collection, we focused on 4 flagship journals, each of them tied to their respective prestigious associations. Now, each of these journals differ in their approach to open science, but together they provide an overall measure of methodological transparency in psychology. In total, across these 4 journals, we collected data from 4,406 studies, which were published in 1,905 articles between 2017 and 2022. For each study, we collected multiple variables that are drawn from the available metadata. Several of these items were followed multiple times, depending on the number of studies that a single paper covered. And based on the collected metadata, such as how many participants participated in a study, incentive details, and the experiment duration, we coded each study according to their eligibility, incentive structure, and the disclosure of methodological details related to the compensation of participants. Now, in terms of our results, I will show you the actual statistics shortly after this slide, but to give a preview of these findings, incentives were reported at a relatively low rate compared to other metadata categories, such as gender ratios or participant backgrounds. The most frequently reported type of incentive was simply the omission incentive details, so when it was not reported, followed by monetary payments. And in some journals, the rate of omission was close to 50%, and in none of the journals with the reporting rate exceeds 70%. Finally, no overall significant difference was found in omission rates across the 5-year period. For our main finding, we observed that 36.9% of studies failed to report details concerning incentivization. Bear in mind, this is a conservative estimate. For instance, percentage on the reporting was higher on the level of individual articles, where it approached more closely to 40%, specifically 39.6%. To give you a full distribution of reporting rates, once again, on the level of studies, individual studies, almost 37% of the authors omitted compensation details in their published research, whereas close to 2/3 did report some information about the provided incentives. So in this case, 36.1% did report something. We coded these alongside 14 different categories of incentive types. In this case, to give a more broader overview of the distribution, I'm using larger categories. As you can see, more than half of the studies that did disclose compensation details provided participants with monetary payments. Mind you, this portion studies includes those where exact payment amounts are unreported and or where the authors fail to disclose the duration of the experiment. For example, authors might mention that they compensate their participants with €5, but as a reader, you are left wondering whether that amount was meant to reimburse an experiment that lasted 10 minutes or an hour. As I indicated earlier, there was no significant difference found overall across the 5-year period. When we zoom in on each individual journal, the yearly differences in the Journal of Experimental Psychology General, the Psychonomic Bulletin and Review emerge as significant. However, we can't really infer any clear trend from these statistics. Instead, it appears that the authors of research papers are primarily self-directing their adherence to open science practices, rather than being guided or regulated by journals or associations enforcing open science policies. Now, finally, for our implications, these poor reporting rates go in line with existing literature carry a number of implications. First and foremost, they highlight a significant gap in transparency that demands wide attention from multiple parties involved in producing, reporting, and publishing science. And this in turn produces unnecessary difficulties for researchers of replication papers, for example. I'm confident that the next speaker, Lukas, will elaborate on the importance of facilitating reproducibility in order to foster greater trust in psychological research as a respectable science. And finally, a second outcome relates to secondary research, such as review articles or meta-analyses that clearly suffer from the refusal of primary research authors to report relevant methodological details. It also prevents researchers from investigating incentivization on a large scale, given that the information is not easily available in psychology journals. Now, in general, we are calling for more standardized and transparent reporting of methodological information, including participant compensation. The replication crisis reveals that transparency is not just a best practice, it's a necessity. And without clear documentation of methods, it's nearly impossible for other researchers to reproduce or extend findings. For this reason, we formulated several recommendations for each party involved in the production of psychology research. For researchers, we simply ask them to adhere more strongly to reporting standards and police colleagues on doing this. For journals and associations, we demand stricter policies related to transparency and open science, and to regulate the authors' adherence to these policies. And finally, for institutions, insofar as they are not doing so, we recommend them to provide additional training on reporting practices. Now, luckily, a lot of developments have taken place in the last decade, including the integration of open science practices in education. And the American Psychological Association has recently also listed compensation details under their reporting standards. Now, finally, I want to leave you with this. Understand that this research is not to invalidate any of these efforts, but rather to celebrate any changes that work towards a more transparent and impactful science. Yet, for this to be realized, we believe there's a lot of work ahead of us. Therefore, our message is really simple and clear. For any party involved in the reporting and publishing of psychological research, state your incentives. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alessandro. That was an awesome talk. Okay, I'd like to open the floor up to any questions or comments. We have time for one, perhaps two, before Lukas's talk. Would anyone like to pop anything in the chat or pop a hand up? Or yes, Lukas, please.
I was wondering, before you showed the slide with the different recommendations, if it was the task of the editors of a journal, or maybe also the reviewers, to look for that. I was just thinking of like the Pro initiative, where reviewers state that they won't accept a paper unless the data is publicly available, for example. So do you think it's also associated with the reviewers?
I think so too. I think a lot of parties are involved in making science more transparent, right? So the more people who are policing these types of policies, I feel like the better, and reviewers definitely have a role in this. Yeah.
Anyone else? Awesome. Okay. Well, with that, I'll say thank you very much again, Alessandro. It was an awesome talk. And we'll move on to our second speaker, Lukas Röseler, who is going to talk about how we cannot solve the replication crisis without replications.
Yeah, thank you. Can you see my screen already?
Yes,
perfect.
We can see.
Right. So yeah, that's my talk now. We cannot solve the replication crisis without replications. Let's take a look. I mean, we are all familiar with the crisis, with the low replication rates, and we know there have been many replications been published in the last decade or so. And here we have the data from the Ford replication database. where we include preprints, journal articles, registries, data publications, theses, and all sorts of replication studies, as long as you can check if they are actually linked to data and if there was actually a study that happened. And what we can observe here is that the rate of replication studies is increasing exponentially at the moment. So this looks really, really good, right? In total, we have about 1,000 replications. Assuming that we are missing many, let's say we have 2,000, maybe 4,000 replications in social science, then it's still not that much, unfortunately. So if we look at rates estimated, you're looking at the replication numbers and also looking at the total numbers of studies being published, both are increasing, and we are talking about replication rates across fields below 1%. In economics, we have data from the replication network, and they are talking about 0.1% of reproductions, and this has doubled to 0.2%. It has doubled. This is great, but it's still not enough. And it's also difficult because we are now already going to the next step. People are asking, can generative AI predict replication success, or large language models? Can we predict replication success? What are the moderators? Do pre-registrations affect replicability and so on? But if you're looking at what we have checked so far, it's not enough. And we are far away from being somewhat able to provide a generalizable estimate on actual replication rates. So we obviously need more replications. So how do we get there? The COS's pyramid of culture change comes to mind here quite quickly. So they say to have a cultural shift, you need to not only to make it required, but also possible, easy, normative, and rewarding. And this is what we have been trying at the Ford Replication Hub. So we are trying to make it possible by providing guidance, and currently we are drafting a 75 pages guide to reproductions and replications, detailing what different types of replications there are, what's the difference between a numerical reproduction, a robustness reproduction, a recreation reproduction, a closed replication, internal replication, conceptual replication, and so on. We are explaining how to choose a study. So should you look on impact, feasibility, relevance? There's epistemic status. So some studies may not even require replication. So you can't replicate the COVID pandemic, and obviously you shouldn't. So all these things you have to look at. And with that, we also try to make it easy. So what we are developing here is manuscript templates that look like a semi-structured form, and they tell you what to write in the different sections. So they tell you should justify somehow why you chose this specific target study. You should compare the original and replication study, discuss the deviations. You should juxtapose original and replication effect sizes, and you should provide a success criterion to evaluate the replication success. We are also working on journal replicability rankings. So right now, people are mainly looking at impact factors or ratings or other types of rankings, which are all based on citations. And what we want, so there's also the top factor, obviously, which is about openness, but they won't update this. They have stopped updating the project in February this year. So what we want is a replicability ranking where you can see how replicable is research published in this journal. And at the same time, you can also see how many studies published in this journal were actually the target of a replication attempt. And then on the other hand, you can see how many replications did this specific journal publish. Because looking at the 1,000 replication studies, most journals only have published a single replication, or maybe 2 or maybe 3. If you look at larger numbers, like what journals have published 20 or 60 replications, then it's only 3 or 4 journals doing all the heavy lifting. And obviously, if we continue at this rate, these 3 or 4 journals, they can't publish 100 replications each year. And finally, the most important part is also to make it rewarding. We did discuss about early career researchers and incentives yesterday, and I think it's also a very important topic here at SIPS. So we have a database where people can publish their results and make them visible, and we will also launch a journal which is peer-reviewed, which gets you a publication that you can put on your CV and then say, I didn't only publish a scientific report, but I made it in the most open sciencey way possible. It was a replication. It's in a Diamond Open Access journal. It has a reproducibility check, and everything is very transparent. And then there's also make it required. This is something that we are not doing at Ford, but there's the research assessment reform with the Quora and San Francisco DORA and the rescue framework happening at the same time. So we are very enthusiastic about getting this culture to shift towards more replication research. Here's a quick overview of all sorts of projects. The one with the blue border are from the Ford Replication Hub. This is a brief overview of the journal. So it will launch in October this year. This is when you can submit your reports. And it's a researcher-led Diamond Open Access, so free to read, free to publish, no subscription, and it's university hosted. So we are independent and non-commercial. It's co-hosted by Ford and the Münster Center for Open Science. It is multidisciplinary. We are currently covering psychology, obviously, but also management, marketing, health sciences, linguistics, neurosciences, and we are also looking into other disciplines, talking to different people, for example, geosciences. We aim for a very high top factor, and skipping to the timeline here. So we have maximum community involvement. We had an online discussion series shaping everything from a constitution to reviewer guidelines, editorial policies. We just had a symposium here in Münster last week where about 20 people came together to discuss some facets in depth. There will be a workshop next month to explain to researchers how to conduct a reproduction or replication that they can then submit to our journal. Then we will have the call, and then we will be open for submissions. And to conclude, this is a service, so we think that this can support replication research across disciplines, and we are pouring our sweat and blood into this, but at some time we will have to check whether it actually works, or whether we should try different ways. So in January 28, we will have an internal evaluation. We will pre-register some evaluation criteria, and we will say, unless we have at least an editorial team of, specifics are not set in stone yet, but an editorial team of 6 people, for at least 5 publications a year and more than 4 publications in the past year. Unless we meet those criteria, we will discontinue the journal. And of course, we hope for that not to happen. So submit your replications and reproductions by October 10th, and try to support replications too. To conclude, there's also many ways to get involved. So we have paid positions, we have internships, thesis projects. So if you're interested in supporting replications as part of these projects, or as an intern at the journal, we have a mentorship program similar to that of Ford, then just get in touch. Thanks a lot.
That's awesome. Thank you very much, Lukas. This is really exciting stuff, and I want to say good luck with replication research. I truly hope it is a roaring success. Awesome. So Priya, you put your hand up. We have 2 hands up and a question in the chat.
Hey, thank you so much. Can you hear me properly? Because I'm in quite a noisy environment.
Yes, I can.
Okay. Yeah, just amazing, amazing amount of work that you're all doing, and yeah, so inspiring. I have a very selfish question to ask. As part of my new job, one of the projects that we're running is to reward early career researchers at the university that I'll be at for engaging in responsible research practices. And as part of that, we kind of have to have some assessment criteria for like both minimum criteria, but also what makes a better version of this practice. And you can imagine if you compare it to something like data sharing, we have like FAIR standards. It's quite easy to assess the quality of data sharing. But I find it really hard when trying to think of how to assess the quality of a replication study, because it's really hard to assess independent of the quality of the study that you're replicating. So I don't know if you've had a think about that. I'm sure you have, but if you have any handy criteria or things that you come up with or advice on that.
Yeah, so how to evaluate a replication study if the original study isn't that good? I think that's the question, right?
Well, how to evaluate a replication study independent of the quality of the original study.
So one aspect is when choosing the replication, and you know the original study doesn't make much sense because it's just based on a theory that doesn't make sense, or the hypotheses are contradictory, then you should just not replicate that, right? So that is one thing to keep in mind. And then no replication will be exactly the same as the original study. There will be deviations. Times change, people change, maybe psychological laws change, we don't know yet. So you will have put some thought into how you have to deviate and how you should deviate, and you will discuss these deviations. And in the simplest case, you have a replication plus an extension. The Gillard-Feldman studies, the later ones, they all have an extension, and the justification behind these, for example, they are all the original study, there's some shortcoming which we are trying to solve, so we just added another dependent variable or another group or something.
Thanks.
Larissa?
Hi, and thanks for the talk. It's fantastic that you're also trying to trying to describe the different types of replications, because also what I encountered in my last publication is that I had a hard time explaining to the reviewers why these are conceptual replications, even though I'm changing a lot of things because it's a different country, it's a different context. So it's cool that then we have a source to refer to that. And maybe you could also add to that guideline, like how to deal with these alternative explanations, what to consider, because of course, when the reviewer maybe was the one whose study doesn't replicate, they say, yeah, you know, this is different, so I think what is really required to say this effect doesn't exist, or is it like what is required is not that stable, or when it's too many changes to say, okay, this is the context, you just changed too much. Might be interesting to have some factors there or a checklist or something. And what I was also wondering about is like these multi-study papers, and when you are having several experiments and then you're just replicating your own experiments, are these included in the numbers you presented on how many or few replicated? Okay, because I could assume that then the number would be larger, because what we typically do is replicate, and maybe there the biggest issue might be like then file drawer effects. So when people actually try to replicate their own stuff, but that fails, and then they just say like, yeah, we don't report this study too. And if you have any thoughts on that, maybe. But yeah, general, very cool. Thanks.
Thank you. So I hope I got everything. So depending on what type of replication you do, you also have different goals, and you can draw different conclusions. So you can't say the original study was a false positive if you deviated a lot. So if you do a conceptual replication, for example, but you can if it's just a numerical reproduction and you don't get the same results with the same code. So we do cover this in the guidelines. About I'm mixing those words up myself. I always have to look them up too. So I think it's internal replications when the same authors do, or when there's author overlap. between original and replication study. We do not accept these articles for reproductions because that's just your homework. People should make sure the code is reproducible. But we do for replications, whereas in the replication database, I think there is a few dozen studies of the around 1,000 where there is author overlap, so that would be internal. But it's always only, there always has to be 2 different references, so they can't be published in the same paper. But yeah, I think that's also an important point.
And finally, Stephen.
Thank you, Lukas, for the great talk and for all the work you're doing to promote replications. I was particularly curious about the guidelines or the criteria that you're preparing. And I was wondering whether you're emphasizing classic seminal studies, or you think we should invest more in replications of recent work, given that, as you indicated, there's only so much capacity to replicate. So where do you think we should direct our attention to?
About the guidelines, the idea started as guidelines, but I think it's more a buffet with all things that you could consider when doing replication research. So like different selection criteria for the target study, we just present them. We don't tell people what to do. We just tell people how to justify why they chose a specific replication study. And it's complex, and it's an interplay of different factors. So an older work may have more impact because there has been more time for others to build on it, but then it may be less feasible because you don't have access to the original data, so you can only do a replication, not a reproduction. And then maybe it's also not well documented, so you don't even know what they actually did and what the order of the variables in the study was. So I think researchers should replicate what they build on. I think that this is the shortest way of making this recommendation. And then, because then most of the criteria are met, you won't build on something that is irrelevant, that doesn't make sense, that you know is falsified or something.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay, well, that is it, everyone. Thank you very much to both speakers. Thank you to Alessandro and Lukas for very good talks. I'm sure you can connect with them outside of the session if necessary. And yeah, I believe we have other workshops going on now if you'd like to dip into those. But thank you very much for coming along, everyone, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.